That was very fascinating and an incredible two talks, I would say. I have, again, many questions, but I'll ask two questions to you, Professor, and then one to Sara, if that's okay. So my first question is, what I found really fascinating is that I've spent most of my life working in the Himalayas. And some of the stuff you talked about, transhumance and this issue of governance, right? It really kind of comes home to me because I've seen exactly this geopolitical, I would say, battle play out in the Trans-Himalayan rangelands, which, as you know, are massive. And one of the things that you mentioned is that governance and the way we partition out property, and also this slow transformation of rangelands going from one to another kind of governance acts as probably the biggest pressure and risk to some of these areas. One of the things that I was thinking is that over the last few decades, Nepal, for example, has really forced and pushed on this community forest governance model, which in many places has worked quite incredibly in Nepal, and has actually allowed for some of this, customary forms of natural resource management to, emerge out of, I would say, the shadows of colonial governance. Do you see any such movement happening in the Sami province? Like, is there a thinking within the Norwegian government to, I don't know, experiment with different kinds of governance, even though it's within a sovereign state? That's my first question.
Well, yes, the answer is yes. We describe in the paper in some detail the 2007 Reindeer Herding Act, which specifically recognizes Sami institutions and methods of governments, and intends to give them a much greater degree of self-determination. And that attitude is a step in the right direction, but it seems to be unworkable. First of all, because there is no guidelines as to how the law should be applied, and therefore how people who are self-determinant are supposed to resolve conflicts, conflicting interests. And also there is a joker clause stating that, well, whatever they decide, we can overrule them anyway. That's the first point. And then the second point is, while in recent documents you see an increasing recognition of the need for bureaucracy to understand the motives and methods of Sami reindeer herders, and that's all well and good, but at the same time, infrastructure development is going on unabated. And it's a ratchet system. You lose a bit, you lose a bit, you lose a bit, you never get it back. It only goes one way. So you can do what you like with governance structures, but when the land is being eaten up, as my 4 maps of Norway showed, eventually you've got no land in which to run reindeer herding, and so how you govern it is sort of immaterial. It's irrelevant.
Right, and so the issue emerges as regulatory, but as well as with sort of thinking about this notion of state building, like what should a state look like and who gets to decide within those boundaries of how that state should act. My other question to you very fast is something, again, which I am very deeply associated with, is the climate justice movement. Because one of the things that you mentioned was the fact that climate change actually is not the biggest player in this room when you think about what's happening to the, let's say, well-being of the Sami. And this is exactly what I've also seen in my work in the Himalayas, where in many ways, the bias, I would say, both in terms of capital and in terms of political, for investments to move towards climate change adaptation and mitigation, often at the cost of indigenous autonomy. This is happening all over the world. And I remember at the last IPCC summit, a new term was coined by some indigenous activists called CO2 colonialism. So it's this sort of re-grabbing of land under the guise of green development, right? And one of the issues that I'm one of the authors of the IPCC report that's going to come out soon. One of the issues I grappled with in that is this notion that, what you kind of started with, the fact that climate change, the effects of it are very integrated within existing systems of power and governance and politics. And it's impossible to separate those two things out, right? And at the end of the day, this is kind of what I wanted to ask you as well. Do you think in some ways this whole, I would almost call it obsession with trying to solve the climate problem is in some ways, communities which have very high development footprints sort of paying for their sins by hoarding more resources, right? It's almost like, I'm sorry, Father, I have sinned, and you kind of pay for your sins by grabbing land from communities who have less political power. And because I've seen this in other parts of the world, that's why I wanted to ask you, do you think this is what's happening?
Yes, I mean, to put it very briefly and rather brutally, it seems to me that sometimes and too often the climate card is played as a very convenient red herring to divert attention away from what really matters. And
absolutely.
I think Sara Katrina said it beautifully, that play the climate card, let's have green energy, windmills. And you saw the map she put up of the density of these things. And so, as I say, it's almost a red herring. And then also, I think we get on a lot further if we stop talking about climate and start talking about weather. Because we say in the paper, the relationship between climate and the weather that actually impinges on resources and animals is not intuitively obvious. And in the reindeer in North Norway, when you look at the weather conditions, you find both positive and negative effects. So for me, climate is a real phenomenon, climate change, it's an ongoing phenomenon, and it is an entirely irrelevant phenomenon for reindeer herding.
That's incredibly said. And honestly, what you just said is what I've been pushing for in the IPCC, to recognize that there's a lot of work now that exactly shows this. However, as you realize, this goes against the machine, so to speak.
Well, that's interesting, because again, I have a whole list of references in the paper from other systems which actually support our conclusion, saying exactly that. People beginning to realize that no, climate isn't the beast.
I agree with you. 100%. Thank you so much for making this point. Sara, I'd like to say or ask one thing, maybe just a comment, is that I wish that you could stand next to people like Greta as well and say what you just said, because I think there is being, in some ways, a very I would almost call it statist colonial vision of climate change and environmentalism and justice. And what you said is so powerful, and it really kind of brings home the fact that we can't be focusing on the nation scale. We have to come back down. We have to ask people like you to really talk to us about what is happening. And thank you so much for bringing that up. The floor is open to questions if anybody wants to ask anything.
Ritodi, that's how you pronounce your name.
Yes, sure, yeah.
It's been an amazing couple of sessions. I have learned two really important concepts, and one was analytical justice, and one is CO2 colonialism. And I've just been searching for a way to talk about my outrage about, I do think climate change is a big problem. We seem to do everything but what we should do to solve it. That's one problem. Let's not drive less. Let's,
Sure.
Grow trees where they don't belong.
Yeah.
Or let's change a forest managed for multiple purposes to one managed for a single purpose. I find that very disturbing too, as well as the land grabs. I guess it's sort of a virtual land grab where you say nothing else that you ever did in this forest counts now because it's going to be for carbon sequestration. I think that's not helping us with some problems we have with fire and so on where I'm from. So I really thank you guys, Sara, and both of you for these wonderful talks. Really, it's been great. And that's not a question. My original question was, why do the elk stay away from the infrastructure? Now I have a pretty good idea. So anyway, that was really interesting.
Anybody else, please go ahead. I can ask
can
another
you hear
one.
me?
Sorry, yeah, Cameron.
Yeah, no, this is Pablo.
Pablo, sorry, go ahead, Pablo.
Kick out Cameron out of Lynn, good to see you. Sara, thank you very much. Nick, we talk every day, so thank you very much anyways. Sara, I would like to hear some more of you. Nick, maybe you can prompt some questions. So it was fascinating. And Ritodi, I was going to, you said, could you run some parallel of what's going on there and here, if you can?
Sure, yeah. We can talk about that. But Nick, what do you? Honestly, I want to hear so much about Sara's life and the work she's doing and the fact that she's politically engaged, which is so important. So I don't know if you can ask her to. I know it'll be difficult in another language, but please, if it's possible.
We can try slowly and gently in English. Sara, could you say some words about your political engagement? I know that you are at the moment a trainee in the Sami Parliament. Could you say a little about what you do and where you would like to go with this?
Yes, of course. Jeg tror jeg må ta det på norsk.
Yeah, you take it in Norwegian, I'll translate. Yeah.
Perfect.
Du kan jo si at jeg føler meg ikke veldig trygg på engelsk.
Yes.
Men politisk sett så tenker jeg at det ikke hjelper. Det hjelper ingen at jeg ikke sier noe.
Okay, take it slowly. Okay, she said politically it doesn't help anybody if she doesn't say anything. Right?
Og altså, som jo 20 år, og de siste 5 årene så har vi opplevd utbygging av vindmøllepark, som har gjort at jeg tenker at, sånn som jeg sa, det har kostet mye, og de erfaringene som jeg har, de så det har gjort så mye med meg at jeg vil helst at jeg kan omsubære alene på de erfaringene, sånn at altså, og heller jobbe for at...
I'll just take one bit at a time. She said she's now 20 years old and she's seen the development of this wind farm in their winter pasture area over the last 5 years. And it's done such a lot to her and her family, and she's got so many impressions, and I assume that relates to the powerlessness of her people, that she feels we have to get involved in this. I want to bring my experience forward and give my experience use. Yeah.
Så til høsten så håper jeg å komme inn i det Sametinget. Og Sametinget, for å være optimist så tenker jeg at man får mer og mer innflytelse i arealsaker gjennom Sametinget fremover.
So she's now standing as a candidate for the Sami Parliament, where the elections are this autumn, and she hopes that she will come in as a member of the Sami Parliament, and in that way be in a position to use her experience to influence the way in which the government manages land use conflicts.
Jeg er også med i et parti som ikke er kun et samisk parti. Det finnes ikke et norskt parti som er i Stortinget. Og det gjør også at vi som parti har et mye sterkere fokus på tradisjonskunnskap og den tradisjonelle måten å forvalte naturen.
So she's standing as a member of a parliament, of a party, which is only a Sami party. Also, the National Labour Party has candidates in the Sami parliament, but she's standing for a party which is only a Sami party. And she thinks in that way she will be in a position independent of national interests to advance the cause of Sami traditional practices and aims and objectives and methods in reindeer husbandry, particularly with regards to land use conflicts.
Nick, can I ask a quick question about that? Sorry to interject. My name is Stefan Van Vliet. I'm from Duke University. I thought it was very interesting to hear about the parliament. I was wondering, and I know the answer to this is going to be not enough, but how much influence does the Sami parliament have in sort of the central government, and how does it work exactly?
Sara, would you like to? Yeah, would you like to say in 2 sentences what the Sami parliament does and how it relates to the national parliament?
Sametinget fungerer i dag mer som Sametinget har ikke direkte innflytelse på arealsaker på den måten, men fungerer kanskje mer som en rådgiver, eller dessverre.
Yeah, okay. The Sami parliament doesn't have direct political influence. It is subordinate to the national parliament. So in that respect, she says it functions more as an advisory body. But I got to give my opinion. But it is an advisory body with unusually high status. I mean, it's not just a consulting group. No, it is specifically relates to Sami issues, and it does carry more weight, even though it does not have direct executive power.
Men personlig jeg tenker personlig at det vil bli mer og mer, man kommer til å få mer og mer innflytelse.
She thinks, in her opinion, she thinks that the Sami parliament is going to carry more and more weight as the years go by. Sara, can you remind me, when was the present Sami parliament building built? It was quite recently. It's in the last 20 years. Was it not?
2001, I think.
Yes. And the new building at Karasjok, the creation of this new building was a very significant event, and it was opened by the king. And it is a platform for the voice of the Sami people like never before, which is good.
If nobody has any question, I will prompt Ritodi to, do we have any parallelism here, Ritodi? What are our thinking in the matters that you're working at the center in this matter?
No, thank you, Pablo, for that prompt. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time because I really, this is such an incredible opportunity to engage with Sara. One of the questions that comes up again and again in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the fact that governance as prescribed by the colonial state often fails to understand the scale at which indigenous communities, in this case, the Maori, really think about well-being, right? And so here at the center, what we are trying to do is really questioning the validity of a certain scale to have the power to deliver any kind of reconciliation, any kind of environmental justice outcome, and to address some of those issues that disappear when you look at things at a certain scale, right? So if you look at it on a, ownership of a personal farm, even though that is 6,000 hectares, it fails to understand that in pre-colonial times, massive migration routes would be crisscrossing these landscapes, right? And so the relationship that people have with the land don't just disappear, because today you have judicial systems calibrating land in ways that make sense to a certain vision of property rights. And holding, I would say, the well-being of social ecological systems hostage to this vision of property rights is at the heart of the problem around any kind of distributive justice, around any kind of action that we may want to take to address some of these hyper-complex issues, right? If today we have an indigenous voice that's trying to engage with us on issues of well-being, what they're really saying is that we have a certain vision of nature-society relationships which does not fall in line with the way that you are thinking. And I feel, Professor, what you talked about in terms of this divergence when even talking about climate and non-climate, right? I mean, climate-society relationships basically are boundary spanning, right? They take into account much of this give and take that happens between humans. And down here in Aotearoa, the way that a lot of, I would say, Maori are thinking about family, right? The whānau, the connection to the land, it far exceeds any kind of, I would say, borders between nature and humanity. And I feel the other issue, which would be very interesting for us also, is looking at how we are measuring, how we are assessing the health and the well-being of some of these rangelands, right? Because at the end of the day, if we are, I would say again, constrained by these very boxed measurements of even the future of the health of a rangeland, we kind of fail to come up with a new way of gauging something which foregrounds, again, this question of justice, this question of voice. Who is it that's being heard? And what do we miss when we look at things at scales which don't quite complement the needs of the multi-stakeholder group we now have? So some of the work happening at the center sort of foregrounds these questions around, the politics of scale when it comes to governance, the politics of scale when it comes to science, right? What kinds of, climate models do we choose to use, right? And the sort of deliberations, the kind of abstractions that are embedded in those models, again, fail to account for the stories that people like Sara have to say. At the end of the day, if we reduce her to just a statistic on some model, which is then statistically implemented on a scale which makes sense to her, we've completely lost anything of real importance that she has to say. And so a lot of the questions is around encountering science itself as a process and what it entails if we have to have any kind of chance at a meaningful collaboration with indigenous communities in this battle against climate change, against thinking about well-being of the future of rangelands. So that's some of the stuff we've been doing.
I just have a comment to what you said there. I agree with much of what you said, but to me, it is absolutely fantastic how you managed to bring the argument back to the climate. It's always climate. And what we see in Norway, with 2 strokes of the administrative pen, these people lost 50% of the winter pasture. Now, there's absolutely no climate model anywhere that projects an effect on a grazing ecosystem anywhere near that in magnitude. It's just trivial by comparison. And that's 50% lost. Treaties, conventions are signed, fences are built, that's it, it's gone. And then, as I pointed out, of the remaining land, they've lost use of full usage of 71%. And these effects are so huge. What's the climate effect by comparison? it doesn't even measure.
Sure.
It's just trivial. And of course, you can find examples in the world where indeed there are presumably powerful effects of climate change on systems. But to me, it is an irrelevance. And it's an irrelevance in this system of such mind-diverting magnitude that green wind farms get popped up. Well, they're green, aren't they? So that must be good. You know, when you've lost any critical faculty.
Right.
Yeah, I could say more about this.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. And Suzanne, I see your hand up. I'll let you say, I'll just one comment to you. And this is something that I'm working on right now. It's called Confronting Colonial Ecologies. And one of the things that you just mentioned is this sort of obsession around climate change being this issue which diverts all of our attention and then ends up, you know, becoming another force for recolonizing some of this land. Suzanne, please go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just in agreement with you. To kind of further add to this whole thing, it's then very often these very people who are losing their voice and their influence who are being portrayed as the victims of, in this case, climate change, and as the people who will benefit from these top-down interventions, whether it's planting 1 trillion trees or putting up wind farms. You know, it's also very paternalistic, but it's, I mean, the irony really is that instead of them having a voice, yeah, they're sort of being put there as the poster children, as the beneficiaries.
Absolutely. Lynn, go ahead. Sorry, I see your hand up.
Oh, well, I just agree with what everybody's saying. I like the term red herring. And I think about the systems I'm studying where there's infinite amounts of publications and science being pumped out about how will pastoralists adapt to climate change. And because of policy, they have lost 50%. I mean, I don't know the exact percentage, but probably half of their grazing land too. And one of the best keys to being able to cope with environmental change or weather, as you mentioned, is having a lot of grazing land. It just enhances your flexibility so much.
Sure.
And that's really an irony and disturbing.
No, absolutely. And again, just to add on to that, you know, there's this phenomenon that's been studied. I'm a political ecologist, so this is essentially what I study. Is there's this movement across the world, has been for a while, of the ethno-environmental fix, right? Of nations putting indigenous people and environmental concerns in the same piece of land and saying, all right, now you guys take care of this. And it's almost like in many settler states, this is the solution to two birds hitting them with one stone. And, you know, there is this stringent, you know, Bill of Rights almost given of how indigenous people should act. And moment you deviate from that, somehow you're not indigenous enough. And then the environmentality of it has to be upheld, right? And so, again, going back to the beginning point, right? Like the state scale is really kind of obfuscating of some of these bigger issues around justice and equity.